There's an expression in Turkish, dört yol, 4 ways, a crossroad. Crossroads are not tidy places. Historically, they were where strangers met, where languages mixed, and where prayer, trade, argument, and revelation shared the same ground. Along the medieval Silk Road, Jews, Sufis, nomads, pilgrims, physicians, and poets crossed paths in caravanserai, shrines, courts, and roadside inns. They debated, translated, borrowed, and listened, and sound, especially, traveled faster than doctrine. This podcast explores those historical crossings, because sometimes the divine is encountered in vibration before it is defined by religion. If you're curious about Silk Road history, mysticism, sacred sound, and the uneasy beauty of devotional traditions in proximity, meet me at this crossroad. I'm the Jewish Sufi Pilgrim. Sacred sound is my path, and this podcast is my caravanserai. Welcome. There's an expression in Turkish, dört yol. It means 4 ways, a crossroad. It's the place where I seem to live perpetually, and as a woman, that can be a tricky place to exist. The Talmud once warned, quote, "When 2 women sit at a crossroad, one on one side of the road and one on the other, facing each other, they are certainly engaged in sorcery," end quote. I haven't yet found the other woman with whom I can indulge this session of sorcery. But even sitting alone at the crossroad, no matter which direction I face, I tend to draw the side eye of passers-by. Maybe it's not about the other woman at all. Maybe it's about the crossroad itself. Crossroads are unsettling places. They're thresholds, places of encounter, places of exchange, argument, seduction, trade, prayer, and occasionally betrayal. They're where strangers meet, where languages mix, where customs rub against one another, where old devotional forms evolve and new ones are born. Historically, crossroads were not clean places. They were messy, and so are the spaces between spiritual traditions. Those spaces are where I find my home and where this podcast will live, Emir Hashem and Inshallah. So why me? Why this crossroad and why this podcast? Well, most people cannot say they have deeply engaged all 3 Abrahamic traditions in their lifetime. I can. I was born Christian in a conservative evangelical context in the American Midwest. Spiritual life was intense and communal. Faith wasn't decorative. It was structuring. It shaped how you dressed, what you read, what you sang, how you imagined the end of the world. From the time I could read, I was memorizing portions of the King James Bible. By the time I entered a private religious college, I had read theology as disparate as Erasmus and Hildegard of Bingen, Thomas à Kempis and John MacArthur, Martin Luther and C.I. Scofield. And yet, even as a child, I had a wanderer's heart. I spent afternoons reading geography books from the library, spinning the globe, imagining deserts, mountains, and caravans. Something in me was already oriented toward movement. In young adulthood, I traveled in China and Tibet. Later, I spent 7 months living with local families outside Kathmandu in Nepal, not as a tourist or as a guest, but really as a member of the family, absorbing the rhythms of prayer and daily life that were very different from the ones that had shaped me. By the time I was 20 years old, I had visited 3 or even 4 of the 5 holiest pilgrimage sites in Tibetan Buddhism. More than a decade later, I moved to the Arabian Gulf with just a suitcase and an envelope of cash. It was after a distinct rupture in my life, and it felt like a chance to start over. Movement was the way to get there. And while I was there, I wound up converting to non-Zionist Judaism. My Beit Din, which is the rabbinic court that convenes to bless your conversion, was held over video conference with a group of powerhouse American female rabbis in New York. And this was just as the Israel and Gaza tensions were preparing to explode. I mean, I've always been one for perfect timing, let's say. When my rabbis asked me what Hebrew name I wanted to take, I did something a little unusual. I kept my own name, Lisa, not as a noun, but as an obscure Hebrew verb ending in ayin, a verb that means to travel. Rashi, the famous commentator, once used that verb when discussing the Exodus in a phrase that translates roughly as, quote, and they had no choice but Lisa, to travel, end quote. This new understanding of my name was given to me as a gift, actually, by Rabbi Gershon Winkler, who is himself a non-denominational rabbi and a passionate advocate for the many shamanic and indigenous elements in Judaism. That name and that conversion didn't feel like a departure for me. It felt like a continuation, like stepping further into an ancestral river that had been running quietly beneath my life for years. Through Judaism, then I, of course, entered Kabbalah, which is the mystical dimension of the Jewish tradition. It's a system deeply concerned with life, creation, and vibration at the heart of the universe. Through the vocal meditation practices of medieval Kabbalist rabbis from Spain, namely Abraham Abulafia and Joseph Gigatia, I learned to open the voice as my instrument of healing, for integration, for creation, for wholeness in myself. I studied Hebrew and Aramaic, and I later founded the Temple and School of Divine Radiance, which was a kind of experimental online space for ritual and study. From 2021 to 2025, I taught mystical chant and biblical goddess theology there. I practiced openly as a Hebrew kadosha, a kind of priestess, and took shamanic journeys, and I helped others awaken these ancient devotional paths within themselves. And somewhere along the way, something interesting began to happen. I noticed that sound, specifically the daily sound practices, created something unique within me. More inner spaciousness, more spiritual connection, more embodied understanding. That sound practice was more powerful than all my textual study or historical analysis combined. And that practice became the foundation of my modern Jewish life, which is a multi-religious, intersectional, and thoroughly contemporary way of being. Every morning, before the city awakes, I practice sound. Breath, letter, tone. Sometimes they're Hebrew permutations of sacred letters. Sometimes they're long open vowels shaped through breath. Sometimes they're tones that follow the contours of an Arabic or Turkish maqam or musical mode. And these musical modes were carried across Central Asia and Anatolia by Muslims and Jews alike. Every morning I chant the Mevlevi Zikr, which is a Sufi sound practice. I also recite a personal, non-sectarian version of the Rosary, one I built around the promises of El Shaddai to Abraham and Sarah, as recorded in Genesis chapter 17, rather than the traditional, of course, Marian prayers that are used in Christianity. But above all, what I love most about these practices is just the feeling of sound running through my body, opening every part of me to the lived experience of God in my body, which, as Rabbi J. Michelson has said, is probably the real point of this whole human journey. Over time, I realized something else. This practice is where my intersectional devotion actually lives. Not as theory, not as a literal crossroad, but as vibration. in this morning practice, Judaism, Islam, remnants of my Christian heritage, even the older temple traditions of Canaan and Mesopotamia, they don't collapse into one another, but they become mystical technologies that resonate in parallel, like one long 4,000-year caravan of what I like to call desert devotion. Kabbalistic letter mysticism, Sufi breath and remembrance, nomadic musical sensibilities carried through Central Asia and Anatolia, different traditions, different and distinct cosmologies. It's a lot. But in the body, somehow they harmonize. That realization actually changed how I understood the transitions and the traditions themselves. Judaism and Islam actually share much historically, but they often articulate the spiritual journey differently. In Jewish thought, especially Kabbalah, the spiritual path often appears as a return after rupture, after exile, after dispersion, after a fracture within creation itself. The human being then gets to participate in tikkun, the repair of the world, gathering scattered sparks of holiness and moving toward freedom. It's in this way that journey or the spiritual path comes after loss. But in Sufi teachings within Islam, the journey looks different. Rather than repairing a rupture, the journey itself is simply the natural condition of human being. The traveler walks. The heart polishes itself through remembrance along the way. The seeker learns to see the divine everywhere within the world. In this sense, the path itself becomes the medicine. To me, the different visions of Kabbalah and Sufism about the journey of the soul, these are not opposing visions. They're two orientations toward the same divine horizon. And of course, this is what we explore when we move into Kabbalah or into Sufism. And through the centuries of encounters between Jewish and Muslim mystics, as I began to study this and to go deeper into it, I saw something remarkable. I found people who were walking similar roads to mine. For example, I met extraordinary Jewish musicians, people in the present day, who were also members of Sufi communities. They made pilgrimages to Rumi's shrine. They practiced with what their Ateshi Ashkhisti Sheikh, Dr. Ibrahim Abdurrahman Farajadeh of blessed memory, known affectionately as Ibrahim Baba, likes to call multi-religious devotion. And this lit something up inside of me. I, the woman who was born Christian, moved to Muslim countries and converted to Judaism. That's about as multi-religious as it gets. And through these encounters, sound became more than aesthetic. It became ontological. Breath, letter, tone, creation itself as utterance. And through all of this, as I began to sink into this place where my practice would be at the crossroad of spiritual traditions, life brought me yet another teacher, Dr. Rahmi Orich Guvench, a Mevlevi Sheikh and also a lineage holding Central Asian shaman, living at intersections of his own. Through his work, he traced nomadic and Islamic healing traditions through music. And something in me recognized home in that. Not because I needed another conversion, but because I already knew the power that sound has to integrate what theology keeps distinct. And Orich Baba, as I like to call him, helped me to understand that through music as well. Music that carries Jewish, Persian, Turkic, and Islamic devotional DNA in its very structure. Music that, like me, had traveled. And that music led me to the Silk Road, not as fantasy, but as historical corridor, to the place where Jews, Central Asian nomads, Sufi mystics, physicians, poets, and pilgrims all shared space. Sounds like home to me. Inside caravanserai, at the imperial courts, in Darushifa, these hospitals where music was used as a sound therapy for healing, and even inside shrines. These groups of people, as diverse as they were, wound up together debating, trading, translating, borrowing, arguing, and listening. And of course, they also made music. So, having arrived in this beautiful place of recognizing the connection I feel within to the Turkic traditions, to the Silk Road, to these places where all the worlds I have wandered and all the spiritual traditions I have loved actually come together. Well, that's where this podcast comes from. This podcast is born from that terrain. The Jewish Sufi Pilgrim will not be an apology for syncretism. All the traditions remain distinct, but history tells us they also met. And when they met, something extraordinary happened. It also tells me that, sometimes they met in physical geography, but now they meet in me. Maybe they meet in you. They meet in the geography of human experience that doesn't fit distinctive categories, and that's okay. You're in good company. I'm in good company with those from the past who also lived at and were themselves the crossroads. So even now, here, I currently live in Cairo. Here even, I live inside these intersections. On Shabbat, I sometimes daven at Ben Ezra Synagogue. This is a historic synagogue. It no longer functions as such, but it's open to the public for tourism, and I'll often go there to sit and pray quietly. In this place was found the Cairo Genitza. This is a very famous cache, if you will, of over 100,000 medieval Hebrew manuscripts that continues to shape the way scholars understand medieval Jewish life across this region. And it was found right there at Ben Ezra Synagogue. On weekdays, I then walk 6 blocks from my house to another sacred space, the shrine of Sayyida Zainab, granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And there we find yet another intense locus of devotion, a place where many people come to pray for healing, for guidance, for wisdom, and for a connection to the power of the saints of the past. So this is life between Genitza and Shrine, between Nigun and Zikr, between Shabbat and Sema. It's not confusion, it's a choice of geography, of liminal geography. So far, my life has confirmed something simple, I feel, that the divine is encountered in vibration before it is defined by doctrine. And that, more than anything else, is what I hope to explore in many different layers and practices and ways in this podcast. So throughout this series, we'll explore these intersections from Devakut and Fana, from letter mysticism to breath practices to pilgrimage, Judeo-Arabic philosophy, alongside, Kabbalistic philosophy, Khorasan as a cosmopolitan laboratory, migratory lineages of sacred sound that still counter and carry the encounter between Jewish and Muslim and shaman, and all these peoples of the Great Silk Road. And we'll return again and again and again to the crossroad. Because if I've learned anything, it's this. The crossroad is not a place of sorcery. It's actually a place of synthesis, Talmud notwithstanding. A place where difference is not erased, but encountered. And as for me, well, I still haven't found a final home. Cairo may not be my last geography. Anatolia may call again. The Silk Road might stretch further north and east for me. I don't know. But through the Jewish the Sufi and the nomadic musical lineages of the Silk Road, I've found another kind of dwelling, a place in which I can take refuge. A teki of Taksim, a shul of Nagun, a shrine of Maqam, a moving, migrating, ever-expanding soundscape that's rooted in historical encounter. And while I explore it in this podcast, The Jewish Sufi Pilgrim, I hope you'll come along. Actually, the title of the podcast is rooted in my personal location: Jewish first, Sufi by association, and always a pilgrim on the move. As Rabbi J. Michelson again would say, quote, "The Jewish way continues to resonate in my heart," end quote. But that resonance, rather than turning me inward, actually calls me to open further outward, to sit in synthesis, which, now that I think about it, maybe is its own kind of sorcery, wherever the four ways converge. So meet me at this crossroad, warm up your voice, tune your instruments, saddle your camels. I'm the Jewish Sufi Pilgrim. Sacred sound is my path, and this podcast is my caravanserai. Welcome. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of the Jewish Sufi Pilgrim. If you'd like to learn more about my work, you can visit lisaengland.com, that's England like the country, or explore the world of Turkish music therapy at turkishmusictherapy.substack.com. If you'd like to share a reflection or ask a question, you're welcome to write to me at Jewish Sufi Pilgrim at proton, proton.me. And if this episode resonated with you, please do consider sharing it with a fellow traveler on the path. Until next time, keep your voice warm, your instruments tuned, and I'll meet you again at this crossroad.